Okay, so I am going to take over now for the next session. I am Marco Pasi from the University of Amsterdam, and I am joined in moderating this session by Mariya Bardyn from the Taras Shevchenko University of Kyiv. I am very happy and honored to be here, to be involved in this seminar, which is first and foremost a scholarly occasion, opportunity for discussion, but to me, it is also a moment for showing solidarity and support towards our Ukrainian colleagues. I think it has already been remembered that in principle, the conference of the European Association for the Study of Religion should have taken place in Kyiv this year, and it's very unfortunate that this has become impossible. I am sure that this will happen sometimes in the future, so it is only postponed. But of course, it is important today to be here together, even online, even virtually, and to discuss how the war has impacted religious life in Ukraine and also more generally in other contexts. So I would like to start with the papers now. I just wanted to remind you that the themes, the topics that had been highlighted for the discussion in this panel were the violations of the international humanitarian law during the Russians' invasion and religious personalities or figures being persecuted and religious buildings having been damaged. The title of this panel is Religious Organizations and Clergymen Under the Attack. And so now I would like to give the floor to Mariya, who is going to introduce the first speaker now.
Yes, I am very pleased to lead this panel with Marco Pasi. My name is Mariya Bardyn, and our panel, we have four speakers, I'm sorry. And in the program, you can see more information about them. And I just want to remind to our speakers that they have about 15 minutes to present their researchers, and all participants can just write some questions, and in the end we will try to answer these questions. So I would like to invite our first speaker, Dmytro Vovk, and Dmytro Vovk to present his report about the Russia-Ukraine war and its impact on religious freedom. Please welcome.
Thank you, Mariya. Many thanks to Ruslan Khalikov and other organizers for doing this very important event, commemorating the first year of full-scale invasion. Let me also use this opportunity for a sort of not self-promotion, but promotion of a few colleagues. Yesterday, we published on the blog of International Center for Law and Religion Studies a sort of religious update on the role of religion in the war and religious freedom implications of the war. And now I'd like to send it to the chat. It's a bunch of, I would say, good pieces, and a few authors are here, like Catherine Warner, Regina Elsner. We also have Jerry Pankhurst and many other good scholars. So just take a look if you would like. Now I'm going to provide a sort of overview of how the war affected or has affected religious freedom issues and other religion-related human rights. So it's not just about international humanitarian law violations. I'm not a specialist in international humanitarian law. It's more about how the war has affected human rights broadly. First of all, from the religious freedom perspective, contemporary Ukraine and Russia create a very different model, as for sure you know. Because of differences in political regime and differences in political and religious markets, Ukraine has had one of the most liberal religious legislation in the region and highly competitive religious landscape, I would say, while Russia has managed to create a very restrictive legal framework regarding religious and belief communities and systematically discriminate against and oppress religious minorities, especially those who do not belong to Russia's so-called traditional religions or state-approved branches of traditional religions. Starting in early 1990s, from a relatively liberal legislation, Russia has ended up with draconian anti-extremist legislation, de facto mandatory registration of religious groups and organizations, significant burdens of missionary activities, humanitarian aid, especially received from abroad, the utilization of so-called religious expert examination for oppressed minorities, which is, however, common for the whole post-Soviet region, and the full ban of organizations of Jehovah's Witnesses, criminal cases against their believers for merely attempts to come together and to read their Bible. On the other hand, Ukraine does not have mandatory registration, does not have any anti-extremist legislation targeting specifically religion, although we have had several attempts to create such a legislation, and have well-established, visible, and social and politically active religious minorities, which means that, as I said, the models of religious freedom from political and legal perspectives are very, very different. Now, the Russia-Ukraine war, starting with the annexation of Crimea and the military conflict in eastern Ukraine and continuing with Russia's full-scale invasion, has had a tremendous effect on freedom of religion and belief and related human rights in the region. Religious regimes established on the occupied territories, however, are not homogeneous. While in Crimea, the Russian government has planted the whole spectrum of religious restrictions previously implemented inside Russian Federation, in eastern Ukraine, especially during the hybrid stage of the war, hybrid period of the war, these restrictions and repressions have been accompanied by acts of pure violence committed by the Russian military and paramilitary groups. During the hybrid stage, human rights monitors reported about murders and kidnappings of believers, tortures of religious leaders and activists, seizure of property owned by religious organizations, discrimination against and stigmatization of religious organizations labeled as sects, and this has related to almost all groups like Pentecostal, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, Greek Catholics, and others. Deportation and ban on entering these territories for priests and religious activists, acts of vandalism, humiliation against religious minorities, including destroying religious items, and as one of Baptist priests told me, using copies of Bible to keep a fire going, cooking food in a Baptist church, prohibition of religious literature for variety of groups, and so on. Since the beginning of full-scale invasion, Russia has continued religious repressions on newly occupied territories. Human rights defenders reported searches in Greek Catholic, Protestant, Jehovah's Witnesses communities on their premises, as well as in parishes belonging to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Several Orthodox, Greek Catholic, and Protestant priests were detained and tortured. Many religious properties were captured and used for military and other purposes. Four defenders have already documented several cases of clerics' arrests and forced detentions, and probably Maksym Vasin will provide you with more details. For example, we know the case of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine priest Sergei Chudinovich in Kherson. He was arrested and tortured by the Russian military in March of 2022. Melitopol-based Protestant pastor Dmytro was arrested and threatened to be murdered. Since November 2022, two Greek Catholic clerics, Ivan Levitsky and Bogdan Heleta, has been detained in Melitopol as well. And I don't know why, but there are many, we somehow received many news specifically from Melitopol. They have been tortured, those clerics have been tortured and accused in explosive storing, that they kept explosive materials on their property. In addition, according to Institute of Religious Freedom, since February 22, the Russian military destroyed and damaged up to 500 religious buildings. And as you probably all know, a bitter irony that a third of these buildings belong to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, historically and ecclesiastically affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate. In his speech of February 21, Vladimir Putin mentioned the Ukrainian government's alleged preparations to as he said, destruct the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And as we already see, Putin decided to prevent this so-called destruction by ruining these church buildings and murdering its believers, which constitutes, from the perspective of parishes, which constitutes the majority of Orthodox believers in eastern and southern Ukraine. Overall, the Ukrainian government and military, the Russian government and military perceived religion as a marker of political disloyalty and so-called anti-Russianness. Some religions, like the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church on the occupied territories, are labeled as nationalist, while Protestant churches are perceived as Western or American. Again, as we know, the only religious group that feel more or less safe on these territories are Ukrainian Orthodox Church communities. Although it's a more complicated system, there are some layers, but there are more oppressed, less oppressed, but just one community which feels safe. And of course, unfortunately, we know cases when some Orthodox priests of the Moscow Patriarchate welcomed and collaborated with the Russian troops when they occupied Ukrainian territories. The Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, reported 60 cases of these clerics being involved in justification of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the incitement of religious hatred, as well as collaboration with the Russian military on occupied territories. In December 2022, a Ukrainian Orthodox Church priest Andriy Pavlenko, sentenced by the Ukrainian court for spying for Russian, was traded with Russia in prison exchange. He was sentenced and he was traded. In February 2023, there was a similar case. Another cleric of this church, Mykola Zirka, was sentenced for 7 years imprisonment for collaboration with the Russian occupying administration in the Donetsk region, and then was also traded with Russia in prison exchange. We see that President Zelensky has become more attentive to religious issues. On his request, the Cabinet of Ministers developed and submitted to the Parliament the draft law on banning religious organizations affiliated with Russia. It's still not very clear what does it mean to be affiliated with Russia, because different laws use different formulas. In the religious law, which is now enforced, we have a formula affiliated with ruling centers in Russia. In this new law submitted by the Cabinet of Ministers, there is a formula affiliated with centers of influence, which even more ambiguous, and this might create a different application of this law. Anyway, we also know that the expert panel appointed by the State Service for Freedom of Conscience recognized that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church still remains the part of the Moscow Patriarchate. This means that this church, as well as some other tiny Orthodox and all-believer minorities, can potentially be banned based on this law. And this is one of scenarios that we can discuss during Q&A session. And this is, of course, also a religious freedom-related topic. On the one hand, religious freedom is not in any way an excuse for calls to violate state sovereignty or territorial integrity, or for the involvement in the collaboration with the Russian military authorities. On the other hand, international human rights law and good standards in this area emphasize that while counteracting national security threats, the government should focus on concrete individuals involved in illegal activities, not on the whole religious group, on religion in general. Measures like liquidation or deregistration of the whole religious organization must be utilized as the last resort when there are no other less restrictive measures, and it's responsibility of the government to argue that there are no other restrictive measures. As the Ukrainian government's approach to this issue is still in progress, I think it might be a good option to involve international actors like the Venice, Council of Europe's Venice Commission, or the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions Human Rights for the assessment of the government's draft law, or the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. It can help to avoid possible criticism of this from these institutions after the law is passed. Overall, despite of the war, Ukraine remains the country where religious freedom of religion and belief is generally well protected. The biggest challenge to religious freedom remains in the domain of what Russia has been doing on the occupied territories. We should be aware that Russia and its bloody attack against Ukraine have turned one of the most religiously pluralist Ukrainian regions, the Donbass and Crimea, into the territory of the grossest violations of religious freedom in Europe. Several religious groups which have been flourishing before 2014 disappeared or left the region, and they presumably will never come back even when the war is over. From the legal perspective, this makes of great importance the task of collecting evidence of religious persecutions and holding liable those involved in these persecutions. Thank you.
Thank you for your report. Your focusing on the legal dimension is very important, and it's very emotional. Your speech is very emotional for all Ukrainians, I think, and not only for Ukrainians. So let's move, and our next speaker is Tetiana Kalenychenko, and she will present his paper about the call of war, religious dimensions of rapid changes from 2022 in Ukraine. So if you're ready, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, and good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you everyone, at least online. And just during the last panel, I changed a little bit my presentation because I heard this really interesting discussion. So just again, greetings from Kyiv region, and I will be talking more on perspective, as always, in my typical identity, both a field worker in peace building and conflict studies and a scholar as well there. So what would I like to pay attention to? There are some trends which we're observing since 2013, I would say, and even earlier. And Dmytro already said a lot about human rights system and freedom of belief. And I would like to pay more attention to some social dimensions and some conflict lines and possibilities, as Regina said on the last panel. So here I'm putting some two practical photos. There are two photos from one of military chaplains, Father Alexander from OCU, who was previously a pastor, and he's serving in Donetsk region since 2014. And that's the reason that's a demonstration on how the car of military chaplain could be demonstrated in two photos. And that's quite, I would say, surprising photo for some international scholars and especially theologians when you get arms and all the holy scriptures and everything as a staff for the priest in one place in a car. And I would say that the main trend of soft power, solid networks, mainly horizontal, and as other colleagues said, interreligious, interdenominational, more connected on a personal level, they're still strong, and especially after the end of February 2022, because that actually creates this resilience and flexibility of Ukrainian society and their pluralism, just to go on with the volunteer work and also to keep going on developing new networks. And it's more connected, I would say, in theoretical background to the web approach, which we can see in John Paul Lederer's work on conflict theory and conflict transformation. Just a little bit more about religious dimension. And I know that Roman Solovey already told a lot about Protestants and Protestant dimensions. I will translate briefly what you can see on the first photo, that it's one of the narratives actually we can see, and more from conservative Protestants, that sometimes they clarify that war is because Ukrainians are sinners, and that's in the reason of our sins. And if we can pray for our sins and be clear from that, that will stop. But that's more about different ways of coping and understanding how the war should be ended. And that's actually connected to other theological claim and how do we clarify war. And right now we can see two dimensions mainly, theologies, I would say in plural, of war and theologies of peace. And one day I put this quote, "Please die in silence," because it was the main response on main religious leaders from Russia in the first months of full-scale invasion, when they wrote to their brothers and sisters, mainly Christians, I mean here, in Ukraine, and they said that please do not write about your situation, about the crimes, about bombing. If you die, please die in silence, because it's actually what God is expecting from you. But here is what I'm saying, that's why we do not simplify the picture, because there are still different trends and not only public narrative. And what I would like to stress more, and here I will tell more about practical dimension, is a question which I hear since February 24th, for the last year, even more than before. Then should we talk about peace during the war, and what should be a kind of peace we're talking? And of course, I would say that the peace dilemmas, there are a lot of ethical dilemmas, and as well as we see in academia. And in the picture, you can see those Russian Protestants from Russian Union of Christians of evangelical faith, who came to Mariupol after occupation, and who established, at least I know, one church or even two churches already, and they're spreading humanitarian aid. It's just a symbol of how the situation is changing and how those religious networks are supporting political narratives. But I would like to draw attention more to intra-Ukrainian level, because it's more important to us to understand, as Ukrainian scholars, what's going on inside the country and how we could proceed with those ethical dilemmas. So first, of course, we've got totally different dynamics of discussions inside religious communities, because all those practical issues of safety, of security, of understanding how you should act, and especially in the first months, when, for example, some pastors, priests, imams, believers, they stayed in their communities and they were under the risk of their life, not only in Eastern Ukraine, of course, and they should have some kind of decisions. Should they stay under occupation if they know that it's a threat, as soon as, for example, the UGCC or OCU representatives who are claimed like pro-Ukrainian and could be killed at the first, together with other volunteers? Or should they leave, but how they can leave if they got family, but they've got some people who cannot leave the community? Also, that's more about keeping the contacts inside denomination network, and I would say even abroad, because I'm really grateful for those horizontal solid networks of cooperation who are still existing not only in Europe, US, and Ukraine, but in Russia too, because there are still those pastors and other believers who are helping to evacuate people from occupied territories of Ukraine. There are several personal stories connected to myself, but other are helping too. And sometimes when official networks and official negotiations, I would say that's more about human rights system, and it's not about theology, but they helped to get back several families, several children, and others who were imprisoned and who were forced to move to Russia. And those contacts are also working. And I know a lot of stories from the grassroots. For example, when people were evacuating themselves in February and March, they used several volunteers group, like they start, for example, with Muslim from Kyiv, then they go on with Protestants, and they get abroad with some other religious networks. And that's actually the soft power, but still the dilemma how to cooperate and how to keep going with this network, and especially when it is high risk for safety for different actors. Of course, another big dilemma, I would say, is its national understanding of war in frames of religious tradition. And it's more not about official statement on non-violence or claiming for peace, but it's more about understanding how do we see the war and how we should actually theologically explain it. Because those people on the ground, those ministers, they've got a lot of questions on everyday basis. Why do we get this war? Why do we suffer? What should we do? How we should stand? Should we serve in the army or not? Because a lot of those who were pacifist before the full-scale invasion, they now changed their position. And of course, it's international representation of joint and individual position, not only on the level of all Ukrainian Council of Churches and religious organizations, but also on different OEC, UNDP, other meetings, because they need it. And there are a lot practical dilemmas on the ground in just of the recent photos. And I've got a lot of questions from international journalists, why Zelensky and Biden came to St. Michael Cathedral and not to the other one. And that's actually a question, but as for me, it's more connected to a commemoration of Maidan events, and because St. Michael Cathedral was a really symbolical place. But that's a kind of understanding how should we proceed with those political dilemmas on the ground, and should we see here some intervention of the state to religious affairs or not. But there are much more practical and existential sometimes dilemmas, as massive killings from both sides of the war, definitely, and massive killings, how to commemorate those victims, how to commemorate heroes, who should be named heroes or not, because we know different cases, and especially in the new project of law on collaboration, there are a lot of issues now in so-called gray zone or under occupation. So, for example, priests who stay in occupied territories and who is, for example, spreading humanitarian aid just to get food for their people. Is he a collaborator or not? There are a lot of questions we need to decide on after the end of the war, after the occupation. But it's more, I would say, connected to what Dmytro, Vovk already said, and maybe Maksym Vasin will be saying. And of course, that special attitude and clarifications for veterans and injured, because we will get much more veterans than before. And as far as I know, there's really different reactions. On one hand, we can see that some churches, mainly Protestants, and mainly conservative Protestants, asking veterans not to wear their military uniform in church, because there they should come not as military people, but as ordinary believers, not to get any sign of militarization. But on the other hand, we've got those ministers who are militarizing their people and trying to get more attention that military activity actually is helpful. Of course, we've got a lot of civil victims of war, and it's needed to be commemorated and also connected to the dealing with the past issue, which we already discussed. And that's another issue, more on theological level. Should we remember by their, I mean Russian victims? Are they victims or not? Or, for example, those who suffering or not, and how we should name those people who were killed, and should we dehumanize them or not? And of course, it's responding to the propaganda and impact on the level of families on a real grassroots, because everyone is now connected any kind of military actions. And I would say that it's more connected to what Cyril Hovorun developed before on theology of citizenship, to be more claiming on understanding how to be a new Ukrainian citizen, but in a theological way, but not to focus on some national and other dimensions that not united. Just to be short, that's more about, for myself, about vision and mission, role and approach in general for religious institutions now, because they've got like 9 years of ongoing crises, and they're pushed to make some crisis decision too. And I think that it's impossible to stay separate from civil society, excluded in some private sphere, because that's a time to take role and mission of religious communities an active part, and also in cooperation with some secular initiatives, and especially in war documentation, commemoration, and creating narratives. It's also about developing collective identity and responsibility, which Regina sold a lot on theology of collective identity and collective responsibility. But it's more about on the issue of social narratives we've got during the war. So how do we act individually? That's one thing, but how do we act as collective? And that's more connected to Orthodox dilemma, because what can we see from UOC representatives? That they're claiming, please do not count on collective responsibility, but count on only individual responsibility. But it's more about our understanding how we should make the line between individual and collective, and where you are part of some denomination or not. And of course, I would like to pay more attention to new adaptive peace building approach, which is trying to get flexibility and all the complicated issues of transitional justice, which is still upcoming, and post-war period of time in flexibility and not in terms of old liberation theories of peace. And just final conclusions about practical work we're still doing. And here are some examples, of course. Probably all of you saw pictures from 16th of February of inter-Orthodox public dialogue of UOC and OCU representatives together with State Service. I was honored to moderate part of this discussion. And I think that, of course, we can see this only on public level, and we've got much more conversations not in public. But it's an important step to understand what narratives do we've got, and is it possible at least to talk with each other normally. And there are other initiatives, because we're still working in frames of dialogue and action initiative, and we're still going with those, not only dealing with dilemmas and understanding how it's possible to build peace. And by building peace, I mean intra-Ukrainian processes, first of all, because we need to focus on internal level, but also in dealing with the ongoing crises, and we will get much more on religious coping with trauma and healing the trauma, because it will be a tremendous amount of work, and I think we will not survive only thanks to psychologists. So just not to take more time, thank you a lot for your attention, and we'll be waiting for your questions.
Thank you, Tetiana, for your presentation, for your photos, and that you arrive in such difficult questions and such difficult dilemmas. So our next paper is about scholars on fire, how to conduct a religious studies research during the war, the case of Religion on Fire project, and Mariya Basauri Ziuzina will represent this paper. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I am really glad to be here with you and to be part of this seminar. I would like Oleg to show my presentation, because I cannot read the text and show presentation at the same time in Zoom, unfortunately. So I will speak today about two important topics, which I tried to connect into one presentation. So my presentation will be devoted to the project Religion on Fire, which was initiated by the workshop for the academic study of religion shortly after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. And along with the presentation of the preliminary results of the project, a special attention will be given to the issue of how it is possible to conduct research during the war, the methodology of the project, the challenges the team faces, etc. So basically, my presentation will have two parts, and you can see them here. And it is very interesting that previous today, we had almost similar discussions on different panels, which means that this topic, the second one, is really important as the first one. Both of them are really important. Next slide, please. So the project Religion on Fire was initiated in March 2022 by Ruslan Khalikov and the team of religious studies scholars from the NGO Workshop for the Academic Study of Religion. I think it is important to mention all the names of the people who work in these extreme conditions and on this project. It is Irina Fino, Ksenia Gurji, Ruslan Khalikov, Anton Lishchinsky, Karen Nikiforov, Lilia Pidgorna, Yelizaveta Rechenets, Uliana Sevastianev, and me. The project is supposed to last till the military actions stop on the territory of Ukraine and all the cases of damage and destruction of religious buildings are documented. Next slide. The goal of the project is to document the damage suffered by religious buildings as a result of military actions of the Russian army in Ukraine. The project also has two major tasks: creating a database of all the damaged and destroyed religious buildings in Ukraine with detailed descriptions of this damage, which can be used by local authorities, courts, or academic community for further study. And the second task is raising awareness about the situation of religious communities in Ukraine during the war, in Ukrainian society and abroad. That's why we use Facebook, Twitter, YouTube to show our activities and to show what's going on with the damage and destruction of religious buildings. Now I will share some general statistics that our team has collected so far. Next slide. You can see here the picture with data about a month ago. Now at the moment we have 413 cases of damage and destructions of religious buildings in our database. I should say that it is not complete because collecting information from the open sources doesn't give us the opportunity to learn what is going on in the occupied territories. In the following tables, you will see that some numbers differ. They do not total in 413 exactly because it is difficult to get some information. And as it was mentioned before, you can clearly see that Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate has the largest number of damaged and destroyed buildings. Nevertheless, the Russian Federation claims that they are fighting enemies, right, somewhere in Ukraine. The second largest community which suffered from this war, these are the Protestant communities, and we will talk about it a little bit later. Next slide, please. If we look at the regional division of cases that we have monitored and documented, of course, it is obvious that the territories with military actions are most, the territories where the military actions were actually going on, right, are most damaged. This is the Donetsk Oblast with 91 cases, Kyiv region with 73 cases, Lugansk region, Kharkiv, etc., etc. Next slide, please. So if we look at the classification according to the damage degree, we have several degrees of damage, if we could say, from weak damage, which means that only 15% of the building was damaged or destroyed, and a little bit of repairing will actually lead to reusing this building, this premise again. And we have cases of complete destruction when the religious building was completely destroyed and it cannot be renovated in any way. So you can see that the majority of the cases that we have here, these are weak damage cases and medium damage cases. So it means that they can be restored and used again for religious purposes. And 9% of all our cases that we have documented are completely destroyed. It is about 36 churches or religious buildings. Next slide. We also have the classification according to the types of religious buildings. And it is obvious that because of the two main religious affiliations, Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Protestants, we have this majority of cases divided between those two groups, right? Those types of buildings, churches and houses of prayer and kingdom halls. Next slide, please. So now we are working on launching a website with 300 cases presented in Ukrainian and English, which will be in open access for everyone. We are also preparing a report on the results of the project in 1 year, so starting from February 24th, 2022 and till February 24th, 2023. It will be published in Ukrainian and English as well, and we will conduct the presentation of the website and report at the beginning of March. We kindly invite all of you to these online events where we can tell more about the specifics of our project. The website, report, and presentations were prepared as a part of project EU Emergency Support for Civil Society implemented by EASR with financial support from the European Union. Next slide. So now we go to the second part of my presentation, which is devoted to scholars. This part is more of a reflection, not a thorough academic study on the effect of the war makes on scholars and research. But these thoughts were brought to life by the war in Ukraine, changes in the religious landscape that was initiated by Russian full-scale invasion, and the fact that religious studies scholars continue to work under such extreme conditions. Being here in the United States, and being immersed in a critical methodological framework, I couldn't start but wonder how these theoretical issues can be traced in Religion on Fire project. I hope my colleagues will agree that we have faced and continue to face new challenges, which we think are quite interesting to explore further. So I will superficially touch upon three main issues: the problem of definition, classification as a political act, and insider-outsider approach. Next slide, please. The problem of definition arose at the very beginning of the project. How can we define the religious building? Is it a sacred building? Is it an edifice where people should enter? What should we do about former religious building turned into secular premises? A lot of synagogues, for example, during the Soviet period were turned into sport clubs. What about cemeteries with the graves of outstanding religious leaders or memorials? The definition itself narrowed or widened the object of our research, which in its part affected the results we envisioned to have. So we have decided to treat any space where religious rituals are carried out or that has a significance for a religious community to be a religious building. Plus, we added educational institutions. Why? Because the educational institutions, they are fundamental for the future of religion. If we don't have educational institutions for some religious community, it means that no religious leaders will be prepared here and no one will lead the religious community in the future. So according to this broad definition, we added cases of Babyn Yar, for example, and Drohobitsky Yar in Kharkiv to our database. It is clearly a political decision because it is important for us to show that some communities, like the Jewish community, suffered from military actions as well. Although the actual synagogues might not be destroyed, such significant places like Babyn Yar affect the Jewish community as well. Next slide. The problem of classification arose when we were to sort information about the quantity of damaged and destroyed religious buildings, which had a specific religious affiliation. It was obvious that we should not unite under one category the churches of Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate and the churches of Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Because at the beginning of the full-scale war, the Russian narrative of fighting Nazis in Ukraine was strong enough, and it was not so obvious that the Russian military ruined everything in Ukraine, not making any distinction between friendly Ukrainian Orthodox Church and evil Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And making the distinction between OUC-MP and OCU is clearly a political claim that we as scholars are obviously making. We have also agreed that we should also diversify as much as possible the religious affiliation in our database for the public to have a clear idea of how diverse and rich is the religious landscape in Ukraine. For example, now we diversify Orthodoxy into three churches: Moscow Patriarchate, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and we have a case of Russian Orthodox Church abroad being damaged. Catholicism in two different groups: Roman Catholics and Greek Catholics, Protestants in three churches, and a group called Others, so with Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mennonites separately. Next slide. Another important theoretical issue, which I found to be most challenging, may be called insider-outsider problem, amic ethic, or critics caretaker. So this is one that we have mentioned today as well. Also, I have based my conclusions only on the team of religious study project. I think it might also be applied to all Ukrainian scholars of religion at the moment of war. We read in Hughes and Makachin's work, Religion in 50 More Words, the following: a critical scholar will probably wish to maintain some methodological safeguards to be able to distinguish participant claims and accounts from those of scholarly one. Whether or not these different viewpoints represent a problem will depend on what a scholar aims to do when studying religion. So do we, Ukrainian scholars of religion, what do we, Ukrainian scholars of religion, aim to do when studying the damage and destruction of religious buildings because of the Russian aggression? We are aiming at fighting on our own battlefield, as we call it. The one that we can fight with our knowledge and skills. We advocate for helping Ukraine to win the war through showing the damage and destruction of religious buildings suffered in Ukraine because of the Russian aggression. It is one of the tasks of the project. As much as we try to be outsiders in this particular research, I have concluded that Religion on Fire project team, as well as probably all Ukrainian scholars who study something connected to the war, are insiders. And quoting again the same work by Hughes and Makachin, given these challenges, we must constantly confront the ambiguity of social life, while more than likely still working to demarcate our scholarly work from simply inhabiting or reproducing the lives of those we study. So let's keep in mind this last phrase. I think it is very important to be conscious about what we're doing and what is the final goal of what we're doing, of our research. Thank you very much for your attention. And this is the last slide, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I would like to say that according to your information, the number of destroyed buildings, it's really impressed in negative sense, of course. And it's very important that our participants can just hear and see this presentation, because it's really very, very impressed. So also I want to say that we have a very active chat discussion, and in the end of our panel we will answer the questions, and I see that some of participants are answered now, so we need more time in the end just to discuss everything in the chat. And I want to invite our last speaker, Maksym Vasin, with his paper documenting the Russian war crimes against faith-based communities in Ukraine. So, if you are ready, welcome.
Thank you. I just want firstly to say thank you to Ruslan Khalikov and to all organizational committee for organizing this online seminar. It is very important to look more close what is going on in Ukraine from different perspectives. Many of you know Ukraine as a state with the most religious freedom, religious diversity, and fruitful interfaith cooperation. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, the situation became the opposite completely on the territories taken under Russian control. And the Institute for Religious Freedom, which I represent, began to document religious persecution committed by Russian military since 2015. We assisted to the Center for Civil Liberties to collect facts and to publish the first report in 2015 with title "When God Become a Weapon." You can find this report on our website. Then in 2018 we published this report, Religious Freedom at Gunpoint, Russian Terror in the Occupied Territories of Eastern Ukraine, and we focused on the religious situation in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This report also is available on our website in English, Ukrainian, and Russian. And recently, in September of last year, we published our new report with the title Russian Attacks on Religious Freedom in Ukraine. And we highlighted Russian war crimes committed since February 24 after full-scale Russian invasion. I also want to share with you some infographics from this report, and probably you can read some news from our website and this report. That's why I just want to highlight new new data. Also, you can download this report from our website in English, in Ukrainian, and in Russian. Also, the summary is available too. But in March, we are going to publish update of this research with new infographics. But now you have chance to see some of charts before the publication. One moment, I try to use these tools for managing slides. We have this chart, and you can see how many religious sites were destroyed in Ukraine because of the Russian full-scale invasion. And you can see also a significant amount of destruction in Kyiv region. It because of the first month of Russian invasion and attempts of Russian military to take under control the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, and because of a very huge hostilities in Kyiv region. Also, you can see some examples of the damages even in western region of Ukraine, like Lviv. It is because of Russian air attacks by missiles, and that's why we can conclude that each religious community in Ukraine is under threat, is under the risk of damage because these massive air attacks of Russian forces can affect any kind of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. The next slide shows you the difference between amount of religious sites were damaged in July last year, and in comparing with our recent data, and the number of affected religious infrastructure were increased in more than twice in July 2022, when our institute presented the first summary of our research. And also you can see that the most churches, mosques, and synagogues were destroyed in Donetsk region. At least 100 20, and in Luhansk region more than 70, and this amounts are increased because of hostilities which is continuing in this area. And also you can see another chart with confessional affiliation of religious sites damaged by shelling or looting, and I can highlight these facts of looting religious sites, and in chat we discussed is it on purpose damaged or just as accident. I can say that both. We documented different kind of destroying religious sites in Ukraine. Sometimes it is because of a very huge hostilities, but also we document many facts when Russian military just shooting, shelling, looting religious sites because they didn't see any value in these religious buildings, in these religious sites. And also you can see a difference between our report in July of last year and our recent data. And also I can confirm that Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was or maybe is affiliated with Moscow Patriarchate till now, affected the most by this full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And also I can highlight the huge amount of on purpose damage of evangelical churches. Very often Russian military seize evangelical churches on the occupied territories of Ukraine because they believe that evangelical churches are so-called American spies or sectarians, and we documented even genocidal intent against evangelical believers, but also against Ukrainian people in general. And just few examples. You can see these beautiful buildings from Svetogirsk Lavra in the Donetsk region. This Lavra belong to Ukrainian Orthodox Church affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate. Very beautiful buildings, very good religious infrastructure, but now we see just ruins. And it is just few examples because you see that amount of destroyed religious site is very big in Ukraine. Just few examples for you. It is how Russia destroyed Ukrainian spiritual and cultural heritage. It is building a former choral synagogue in Mariupol, which were restored recently by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Primarily inside this building, they they rebuilt this building, but now you can see just ruins of this building. And in Mariupol, a lot of buildings were destroyed. And according to our project, we believe that the statistic cannot show whole picture, whole pain of Ukrainian people. And we documented testimonies of Russian war crimes from different religious leaders from local level who suffered Russian on purpose persecution. And you can watch all of this video on our YouTube channel. And recently we produced several more videos with new testimonies, like testimony of rector of the Tavritsky Christian Institute, which were destroyed by Russian military in Kherson. And after liberation of Kherson, and we documented new testimonies of local religious leaders, like also Alexander Babichuk, who represent the Ukrainian Bible Society and local Pentecostal church in Kherson. Also, I want to stress that our Institute for Religious Freedom is not only organization who document Russian war crimes. I also want to thank you, Ruslan Khalikov, Anna Maria, and other specialists of the workshop for academic of religious studies, and also the initiative, the Tribunal for Putin, which supported by Civil Center for Civil Liberties, Kharkiv Human Rights Group, and other human rights organizations. A lot of other organizations do this important documentation, but as for our institute, why we do this research? Firstly, we use this data, these testimonies for our international advocacy, because we see that abroad, outside of the Ukraine, a lot of people don't know about Russian religious persecution. A lot of diplomats, international organizations, foreign politicians don't know about situation on the occupied, on the Ukrainian territories occupied by Russia. And that's why we believe that it is not an option for Ukraine to freeze this conflict, and Ukraine will not agree to remain occupied territories under the Russian control, because on territories controlled by Russia, there are no any religious freedom, no any human rights, no any justice and justful court system, independent court system, no any access of international observers. That's why we believe that only one option to restore religious freedom and human rights on the territories occupied by Russia, it is to kick off Russian military from these territories and to liberate these territories from the Russian influence. And we prepared several recommendations for international community regarding our report. Firstly, to create a special tribunal for the punishment of the crime of aggression against Ukraine, and also to support the efforts of Ukraine in investigating and prosecuting Russian war crimes. And we believe that our report and testimonies which we filmed will be very useful for further litigation against Russian officials responsible for these war crimes. And also we continue to promote the idea of personal sanction against Russian official religious leaders, media workers, and other individuals who are responsible for justifying or implementing repression against Ukrainian religious leaders and faith-based communities. And also we call to a World Council of Churches and other interfaith, international or local councils to condemn the Russian world ideology, Ruski Mir, and also condemn the engagement of the Russian Orthodox Church in justifying this war. Finally, in conclusion, I also want to add that our work on documentation, it is very important also for Ukrainian religious organization, because very often they don't collect information about Russian persecution and about a scale of damages of their religious infrastructure, but presenting this report and this data internationally, we try to facilitate, to promote this idea among religious leaders of Ukraine that it is very important to record this real situation in Ukraine, to show internationally and to save this information for history, that the Russian occupation of Ukrainian territories affected also religious sites and believers. And also I want to mention that we, in our work, we not only consider the open resources, we conducted surveys among religious leaders of at least 20 different denominations, and also we continue to interview different local religious leaders, primarily on the territories occupied by Russia, and it helps us to see whole picture of religious situation in territories under Russian control. Thank you for your attention.
Thank
you, Maksym.
Very much. Maksym Vasin, and I take the floor again, thanking all the speakers so far. So we have about half an hour now for the general discussion. I have to say that it is difficult to see certain slides, certain images, and not to be emotional about it, to see the extent of the destruction that has been going on. I have seen that the discussion has been going on actually in the chat, and it's very good. So I don't know that we can use necessarily what has been going on in the chat to distill some questions, because I think that it was actually really a discussion. And of course, the persons who participated in the discussion can come back to some of the things that have been mentioned there. As for me, I think if I can summarize very quickly what has been said, I think that it is very important, of course, to document the destruction of the religious infrastructure, buildings, the damage that has been done also to religious persons in Ukraine. I think this is very important, not just for now, but also for the future. When it will be important to realize the extent of what has been done, and also how to repair what has been done, how to reconstruct. I think also that probably this should be separated from the level of analysis, because I think there are many questions. One thing is to see what has been destroyed, and another to understand why it has been destroyed, whether things were, for instance, damaged or destroyed because they are religious buildings, for instance, or whether this was just a tactical or strategic aspect of the war itself, that sometimes buildings can have a particular strategic value. They are occupied or they are hit, they are destroyed, not so much because they are religious, but because they find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time in a logic of war. So it will be important at some point to have an analysis also of this, although I think it is extremely difficult perhaps to do that at this very moment as the war is going on. And the comments that I'm making are based also on some of the questions or the discussion that has been going on in the chat. I think the problem of demarcation is also very important, and I think that some of the papers were very right in addressing also the theoretical issues, because at the end of the day, similarly to what I mentioned before, again, it is possible that sometimes buildings were destroyed and people were hit, but there might be also a political element that, for instance, persons might also have taken an active part in the conflict, and therefore, in some cases, perhaps they got involved. They found themselves in difficult situations, not so much because of their religious identity, but also because they were part of what the conflict led people to be in. So in that sense, the demarcation between religious and non-religious, or religious and secular, is important. This is also something that was mentioned in the chat. So I would suggest that we might go back to some of these issues, but for now, the floor is open. I would suggest that we use the usual way. So you can raise your hand with the Zoom tool, or you can also do it physically like this. And Mariya and we will try to monitor, because of course there are many people and sometimes it can be difficult to see everybody, but we will try to look at everybody, and so to give the floor to everybody who wants to participate in the discussion. I see already hands being raised, and the first hand that I saw is Mariya Basauri. So please, Mariya.
Thank you. I would like to make a short comment because my presentation was like two-headed beast. I would like to mention about the analysis, right? We have published our 6-month report, and I have given the link in our chat. There, we tried to make some kind of analysis, right, of what it means for the Ukrainian religious communities to have so many destroyed buildings. We didn't touch upon the topic of why they were destroyed, actually, because at this moment it is sometimes difficult to understand, and even if we know who exactly destroyed the building, right, because of the future possible international law, how is it called, international court cases, right, we cannot how is it called, make this information public. But we, according to our analysis of our group Religion on Fire, we see that the damage for religious minorities is the most dangerous for the religious diversity of Ukraine, because huge religious churches like Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they will survive, as we think, because they have a lot of incomes and support from the population. But someone mentioned today already that some groups which were not numerous in numbers and having only one, for example, a religious building in Ukraine in general, like the small group of Ukrainian Karaites, if I'm not mistaken, it is in English. They had only one building religious in Kharkiv and it was damaged. So it means that the whole community, it doesn't matter whether it is big or small, right? This religious minority, it made the religious landscape of Ukraine more diverse, right? So losing one religious building in this case is very important, because we are losing the general, the place for the whole community to pray, right? To make their religious rituals. That was one of our conclusions that we've made in this analysis. And there were some others, so I encourage you to download the report and to read it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Anna Maria. And I wanted to ask you, because this is also related to the problem of demarcation. I think also to determine, for instance, whether a particular building is a religious building is also part of the problem, because, and by the way, this can be applied also to the problem of religious persons or clergy, because with more established or traditional religious formations, this may be easier to determine. With some new forms of religion, new religious movements, sometimes the things are a bit more blurred. So this, I guess, is also part of the problem, right?
Yeah, it is very interesting, you know, how we can observe this. I'm losing the words. I'm sorry. How can we observe the process of like these huge theoretical problems, right, which bothered religious studies communities for decades, how they appear on such a practical level? So the idea of the project was to document, to bring together all the information and to show it to others and to make it possible to use in different ways. But in the process of it, we can see that it is not enough just to do what we always do, right? But it is also very important to look at the theoretical basement. All these discussions we had about what is a religious building, who is a religious leader, if it is just a person who has a lot of who is she or he is a leader of the community, but she that like informal leader, right, without any formal power. Do we think that he or she is a leader, or do we put it into our database or not? So it is, I think it is this understanding of the theoretical problems may give us some kind of this methodological objectivity, right? So that we finally we can separate our emotions, which when I started to prepare this paper, I was convinced that I'm very objective. I'm not in Ukraine. I'm not a religious person. Like, I'm a religious studies scholar. I thinking, yeah, I am an outsider in this case. Now I will show how outsiders work. And then I realized, after looking into different literature and thinking about these topics, that no, even in this case, when I'm trying to be as detached as possible, also from the psychological point of view, because it is difficult for Ukrainian scholars to detach emotionally from what we're studying. Even in this case, I am not an outsider, I'm an insider, definitely. So this is very important to start to think about these problems while we are involved in researching something during the war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. This is very clear. I would like to give the floor now to Richard Croft, who has been waiting for a while.
No, it's good. Very interesting discussion. I noticed in my data, it's from the 1990s, the fall of the USSR, that we have this multitude of growth of new religious movements and new religious things. So the destruction of these new forms or individual subjective forms, I have Messianic Jews in mind as well in Ukraine, which is quite a center. Is this an attempt to stop subjective individual change and enforce a monologue? Is there signs of that in this data, that this is a purposeful attempt to stop the new things? Like LGBT, you could say it's the same. It's an individual subjective thing. So these are the same things. So that's my question. Is this trying to reverse or trying to restore some kind of old order?
So who wants to take up this question? Was the question addressed to anybody in particular?
Not particularly. I just I'm responding to the discussion that we've had, and I'm thinking it through with my own data, and I'm thinking most of this is quite new. Most of this diversity in the religion is quite new. So is this because it's new that it's being targeted? That's really the question.
Yes, and I would like to mention that the LGBTQ question was also mentioned in the chat. So it's something that came up, and I think it would be interesting actually to take it up also during the discussion. Okay, thank you, Richard. And those who have spoken can lower their hand, of course, once they have, unless they want to ask another question again. So I would like to give the floor now to Tetiana Kalenychenko. Oh, sorry, Anna Maria, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I wanted just to reply to this last question. I will not say that Russian Federation is attempting to destroy the religious minorities in Ukraine. I think for them it is it doesn't matter who to destroy, unfortunately. And the data collected shows that they are targeting even the churches of Ukrainian Orthodox Church in affiliation with Moscow Patriarchate. But I think that the problem is more about the Orthodox churches in Ukraine. I'm not a specialist in this case, but what I observe is that this problem of unification, it continued for many years. It is not the problem that arose after the revolution of dignity, right, or after the full scale invasion. It is a problem which existed previously, and these two cases, this violence and war, they just ignited, it seems to me, right, the problem. So it made it obvious more for general population. And I think it is also mentioned in the chat that we should often the religious discourse is used with clearly political contexts, right, and it is used to involve people who are not specialists, right, but in an emotional way, which is a clear manipulation, right? So this is like also we have to be aware of these cases, and maybe the religious studies scholars should show these cases more explicitly for better understanding of the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Tetiana Kalenychenko has been waiting for a while, so please, you have the floor now.
Yeah, thanks so much. But actually, Vasily was waiting more than me. But yeah, I will just
sorry,
talk a little bit.
I saw you first, but go ahead, and then it will be for Vasily. Yeah.
I will briefly just continue as this conversation on LGBT, and thanks to Regina for sending other text. I mean, like, I really like on profound, because I know several scholars who are working on discourse and narrative analysis on correlation between those fundamentalistic narratives we've got right now, and we've got it from both sides. So it's not only about pro-Russian side, but also on those militarized religious leaders, and somehow those anti-LGBT and traditional values protection narrative are highly connected sometimes with pro-Russian propaganda, just because they are insisting on protecting those traditional values. And you can see it especially during the Trump election process in US and clarification by Protestants, and by Orthodox people more, but for me, it's more about Protestant cases. And just to add briefly, this issue of subjectivity, and I think that it's impossible to say I don't believe in pure objectivity anyway, and it's really possible to be inside and be outside, by being too conscious about your personal limitation and how it's possible to create the academia criteria in order to analyze what you've got as a surgery, for example. And just to be honest, that, for example, on the previous discussion, we've got this issue of dehumanization. And as for me, from my side, from field work, it's more dangerous for our Ukrainian side that in relation to Russian, because if we're taking this narrative, then we're changing ourselves, but not them. And I am no more responsible for Ukrainian side, not to continue with those black and white worldview and simplify worldview. So that's, as for me, as a task of academia, to get complicated picture and to address it, even though it's not possible for me, for example, in Ukraine, to see all the perspectives. And I think that we will see at least some kind of complicated picture in 10 years after the end of the conflict. But still now it's the moment to collect the data, to see observations from different sides, and to get this correlation. And just a final point, I saw several works, and it's more connected to policy papers and academia papers, but still on neglecting the terms of securitization, politicization, instrumentalization of religion. And I think it's quite dangerous if we are not naming the effects and trends we see as it is, just not to, for example, to be offensive to some religious organizations. We should clearly understand the criteria of securitization of religion and to see how it corresponds to different social objects, and also to connect it to security issues, because it's the reason what we've got, as for me, in post-war period of time, when we've got all those cases and criminal cases, not only an international and Russian-Ukrainian case, but inside Ukrainian case, and especially on deoccupied and liberated territories. So we already have it, and it's really important just to be clear in our terms and to be clear in our analysis too. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Tetiana. Now I will give the floor to Vasily Maksymishynets.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to pose two questions, if possible, and maybe most probably to the first speaker, Dmytro Vovk, but other speakers, of course, may react as well. My first question would be, do you think, Dmytro, well, I would like to ask about the recent religious analysis of this state service for ethnopolitics and freedom of conscience. This service, or the experts that are in this committee, were employing terms that are completely church canonical and not juridical. For example, they were using terms like autocephaly, and they were blaming the Ukrainian Orthodox Church for not cutting ties with Moscow Patriarchate, because one of the argument was because they did not proclaim autocephaly. They were claiming that autonomy or independence is not a canonical term, so this means that Ukrainian Orthodox Church is not autocephalous. Do you think that is it appropriate? Is it not problematic? Is it not like intervention to different field when the state uses church canon to impose like a civil law. This is my first question, and second, if there is time, of course, would it be possible to comment on searches that we saw in November and December of different bishops, some monasteries, and these searches were public. So normally there's intelligence agency before the war, when they did these searches, it was normally unpublic. So, and often they leaked information, pictures, sometimes pictures with semi-naked people to the media and showing and trying in this way to discredit religious organization. Do you find that this is a form of suppression of religious freedom? These are my questions.
I think the questions were especially for Dmytro Vovk, right?
Shall I jump in?
Yes, the questions to Dmytro Vovk about about searches.
Or whoever wants.
Or whoever, yes,
of course. Please, Dmytro.
Well, the second question is easier because searches are fine, publication of materials are not fine, for sure. But this is SBU's problem, not only with respect to religious communities, but with respect to everyone. And I disagree that it's the problem only since the beginning of the war. Actually, we have had many situations when law enforcement bodies published some materials before the decision of the court. And I know that there was a sort of quite significant reaction from human rights defenders in Ukraine, or at least some important figures in the human rights communities. So of course, leaks with half-naked boys or kids and leaks with some sort of materials are not wellness. They are not in line with standards of freedom of the right to fair trial, for example. The first question is more difficult. First of all, what is important for me that, of course, religious examination, expert examination, is a tool which has a very bad reputation across the post-Soviet area. We have quite a few number of cases in Russia, Belarus, Central Asia, when religious expert examination was utilized for oppressing religious minorities. Our situation is different because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow advocate is not religious minority, and because there is a war. And this, of course, makes the situation with human rights much more difficult, not only with respect to religious freedom. This is the first point. The second point, international human rights law and best practices insist that the government is entitled to check only formal issues with respect to religious organizations' documents, which means that you can check the charter with respect to its accordance to the law, but not to some religious canons. When you start to analyze religious rules, there could be different interpretations. When you start providing this substantial assessment, there could be different approaches to what does it mean to be autocephalous, or what does it mean to be Orthodox, or what does it mean to be religious, and so on and so forth. And I can mention, for example, a couple of OSCE or DHR documents, so Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where it's clearly stated that this sort of analysis should be formal only. With respect to the expert opinion that was done with this February, I think, it was published this month. I think that the biggest problem that, first of all, that the whole commission was focused on this ecclesiastical issue, and there was no, I would say, specialist with clear expertise in religious freedom. Because the question is not only about canons, the question is about the limits of the state interference in religious life. The second point that, of course, what we have in the law on religious organizations, that affiliation with Russia is defined through the documents of the Russian Orthodox Church. And until the Russian Orthodox Church, according to contemporary law, perceives the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate as a part of the Moscow Patriarchate, for the contemporary law, and I presume for the group of experts analyzed the document, is enough to think that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is affiliated with Russia. Well, my question, not even question, but point that the Russian Orthodox Church will never recognize the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as an independent church, which means that in this situation, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has no options to prove its own independence. And it's a sort of evident argument. I think it was even put by the church itself. So, as I said, in my view, the strategy that it looks like the Ukrainian government is going to take might be problematic. And one of signals of this problems that I think it's the first time when religious draft laws that are now in the parliament are being discussed in international organizations before their adoption. Because what I know that the United States International Commission on Religious Freedom is monitoring the situation. The ODHR, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is monitoring situation. That's why in my presentation I said that it would be great to stay in touch with those organizations and get some of their expertise and advice on how to frame this law in accordance with international standards.
Thank you very much, Dmytro. I just wanted to say that we started a little bit later with the session, so we can take a few minutes also if the discussion continues. And there is now Maksym Vasin, who has been waiting for a while. Please.
I just want to respond briefly to question about the reason of this huge destruction of religious site by Russian military in Ukraine. I didn't mention in my presentation that our institute documented many cases of siege of religious buildings in Ukraine, and therefore their use as Russian military bases, or to conceal the firing position of Russian troops. And this tactic of the Russian military provokes an increase in the scale of destruction of religious sites in Ukraine. And we have such example like Tavrisky Christian Institute in Kherson. I mentioned this institute was looted and religious literature were destroyed by Russian servicemen, but the main buildings were destroyed by shelling of Ukrainian forces because Russia used these facilities as their military base. The same situation we documented in Irpin, in the building of Mission Eurasia, when Russian military just organized their headquarters in this religious building and brought a lot of heavy vehicles around this building, and that's why this building was suffered by shelling in these hostilities. And also we noticed this tactic when sometimes Russian military not sometimes, very often Russian militaries use these religious buildings maybe with hope that it can be more safe for them to use church buildings to avoid a fire in response from Ukrainian military. But primarily when Ukrainian forces maybe accidentally destroy some of these religious sites because of hostilities, Russian propaganda just use these facts for condemning Ukrainian forces in destroying Orthodox churches, but they didn't mention that they provoke these damages. That's why it is important also to understand why we have so much religious sites destroyed by shelling and because of these hostilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Maksym. There is Dmytro Vovk now, who has raised his hand.
Yeah, and just a quick comment with respect to LGBTQ issues, because first, we are now tend to think that it's all under the influence of Ruski Mir and this traditional values narrative promoted, advanced by the Russian government in concert with the Russian Orthodox Church. But the problem is that the leaders of this movement in Ukraine are not Orthodox communities. The leaders are Protestants and to a lesser extent Greek Catholics. And all these anti-LGBTQ laws which were proposed to the Ukrainian parliament, all the situation around the Istanbul Convention, it was the situation when Protestant voices were much louder than the voices of the Orthodox Church. And we also know, and again, LGBTQ community, Ukrainian LGBTQ community try to put it in this way that it's all Russian propaganda, but we know that American Protestant groups and big Protestant churches, they did fund anti-LGBT community, anti-LGBT activities in Ukraine. And there is nothing surprising in that, because we know that how Putin was, and to some extent even is, popular among American far rights religious groups, or people like Viktor Orban, so popular among them. So unfortunately, the situation is a bit more complicated and difficult than just, the influence of Ruski Mir propaganda. It's a part of cultural wars, but not only the war that Russia and maybe China is conducted against the West, but it's also a part of cultural wars in the West, to which Ukrainian religious communities and maybe LGBT communities as well are included.
Thank you very much, Dmytro. I actually had a small question myself, and I see no other persons raising their hands, so this might also be the very last one, perhaps. Obviously, the whole seminar
was Michael, I believe, Strimska, no? I'm mistaken.
I was trying to applaud. No question.
Okay.
Sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry, because I hadn't seen a hand. Okay, good. The whole seminar and also this very panel is very much focused on Ukraine, of course. But I was wondering whether some of the issues that we have been discussing could also be part of a broader comparative analysis or perspective. So I was actually wondering whether the speakers of this panel, or also the speakers of other panels, if they're here now, would like to comment on that, whether a comparative perspective might also be useful. It's something that they have considered or something that they might engage with also at some point in the future. I see Tetiana Kalenychenko raised her hand.
Yeah, thanks. At least I can see 3 topics, at least, as minimum. So all about geopolitical relations in Orthodox world, and that's more connecting not only to intra-Ukrainian problem, but more connecting to global world orthodoxy. Another one that's actually about narratives and LGBT and other traditional values protection and other topics which we focus today. And in general, securitization of religion, definitely. And as from my side, I'm still looking for those scholars who are working on de-radicalization practices of post-war period together with by using and together with religious factors, and also religious factor in peace building and post-war recovery personally. So at least 3, but I think that it could be much more.
Thank you very much, Tetiana. And now, Dmytro.
Muted microphone.
You have to unmute yourself, Dmytro.
Yeah, sorry. First of all, I agree with Tetiana because the war identified several problems which are relevant to the whole Orthodox world, not just Ukraine or Russia. And the war just make it sharper and more visible. The second point that, of course, this war also shows us the process of individualization of religion and a sort of destroying the line or blurring the line between religious and non-religious, because all these narratives of desatanization of Ukraine, of sacred territory that Russia protects, of sacralization of this sort of Russian world and the religious element of the Russian world is also about different versions of religion, something that is considered to be religion, and imposing religious frameworks on political categories and framing in certain way religious beliefs and so on and so forth. So Russia tries to position itself as a sort of protector of traditional values, but actually, in my view, I'm not a specialist, their approach to religion is very non-traditional, is very sort of postmodern, when religious, everything could be claimed to be religious, everything could be claimed to be sacred, everything could be claimed to be sort of a matter of religion, and so on.
Thank you very much, Dmytro. So I think
may I
yes?
add just a second?
Please, yes.
Continuing what Tetiana and Dmytro said, and also focusing on what I have said during my presentation, I see a huge educational potential in the research that we're conducting now, because from the point of view of critical thinking, right, this is unfortunately Ukrainian case can be now the example of many things that we theoretically think about as scholars. So I think it is also a fruitful field to analyze not only the how's it called, to the primary sources, right? I mean, someone saying something, representation of one church, claims of traditional values or other things, but also to analyze what the experts or what the religious studies scholars are doing, what they are saying, right? And in what specific context they are and what implications they are making by their statements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. And this brings me, I think, to the end of this panel. So I would like to thank all speakers, all participants, also on behalf of Mariya Bardyn, with whom I co-moderated this panel. It was an honor for me to be involved in the seminar, and I would like to thank Ruslan Khalikov and Lyudmila Filipovich organizing the seminar. And also, I would like to thank the European Association for the Study of Religions, President Kim Knott and General Secretary Jenny Berglund for facilitating also the seminar. And well, now we will close the seminar with some final remarks from Lyudmila and from Ruslan. So I give you the floor now.
Thank you so much, Marco. First, probably I would like to give a floor to Professor Knott with closing remarks, and as a head of European Association, and then we will continue with Professor Filipovich.
Thank you very much, Ruslan. What a fantastic seminar it's been. I think that both you and Lyudmila must be very happy with how it's gone. I can see you are. So on behalf of the European Association for the Study of Religion, I'd like to thank both of you, of course, and any of the others of you who've been involved in the organisation of the seminar, as well as all those of you who have given fantastic papers, such a wide range of papers, and of course the moderators as well, both from the Ukrainian scholars and from those outside the Ukrainian academy. Also, what a wonderful audience, in the sense that we've had real global reach and support from colleagues from many, many different countries and time zones, and that's been wonderful to see. I've learned so much from the wide-ranging papers and discussion, some of the discussion quite passionate, which was very good to see. We've heard from Ukrainian scholars, of course, and that's been really informative, as well as non-Ukrainian scholars who work on Ukraine itself and religion in Ukraine, and that's been most welcome. We've had a discussion of issues of religious cooperation, contestation, religion and state, the state of places of worship, the role of churches, other traditions, minority religions and their interrelationships, a whole host of issues, as well as some new agendas, some methodological issues and some theoretical ones. So it's been really wide-ranging. I don't want to take any more time other than to say, see you in Vilnius later this year, from the 4th to the 8th of September. We hope to see you then at the European Association for the Study of Religion's annual conference in Lithuania, and see you in Kyiv in the not too distant future, we hope. And we wish you all really well, and certainly we all wish for a just end to the war. Thank you very much, Ruslan.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much. Ruslan, may I ask, tell some words, yeah? As a result of our seminar, dear colleagues, really, Kim is right. During our seminar, we spent such a short, but I think very fruitful time together, reflecting on the nature and causes of the war, and on how it affects religion, religious life, and what are the consequences of this barbaric aggression against the civilized world. I am extremely grateful to everyone who prepared, organized, conducted, and enriched our meeting with content and meanings. All of you not only contributed to distinguishing Ukraine as a special object of our scientific attention, presenting it as Ukrainian case, but we outlined the subjectivity of Ukraine as a state, as a nation, as a unique civilized world, a part of Europe. During these two intensive days, and before that for a whole year, you were interested in Ukraine. You focused on our problem, on Russian-Ukrainian war. I hope now Ukraine is on your scientific and existential maps. You worried about us, you supported us by warmest words, timely advice, and concrete action, providing the platform of university and ensuring the safety of the seminar. You believed in us and instilled hope that everything will work out for us, and that we will not only hold this seminar, but also defeat this universal evil. I invite you to celebrate the joint victory in free Ukraine with a real offline live conference of EASR nearest future. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. As for me, I would like also to thank colleagues who are interested and visited and attended this seminar. And of course, our speakers, our moderators, and all those who were involved in organizing this event. And I'd like to agree and to urge all participants to make new research works on the religious situation in Ukraine and on how this impacts the religious situation in broader manner, like as Professor Pasi said. And on our side, we hope to publish some kind of proceedings after these seminars, and we will publish also recording of these 2 days. And it was a great idea to conduct such kind of seminars in future. I think we need to do the second session, second seminar. Also, I'd like to remind that Professor Intravinia suggested yesterday to discuss how to help Ukrainian colleagues, and maybe it is good idea to involve Ukrainians who are in different European, American, African, Asian states to research work, and maybe it's time to add religious dimension to Ukrainian studies, for example, in world universities. And also, as a conclusion, I'd like to remember words said by Professor Pasi a few years ago in Kyiv. He told that despite all the borders, despite political populism, and I'd add now that despite COVID and even war, European religious studies community remains united, and we are united in methodology and also in our values. And the organizing committee is extremely grateful to the European Association for the Study of Religion for its support in organization of this seminar, and we are aware that such topics will be discussed on the EASR conference in Vilnius, and we are proud to invite you all to attend this discussion in Vilnius. I hope many Ukrainian colleagues also will attend this conference online or in person. So let's do our research work together, explain the religious dimensions of the war to our societies, and take care of each other. Thank you.
Thank you.